Hi, and welcome back to the data science course. We are still in part one, machine learning data analytics. In this lecture series, we'll learn about one type of unsupervised learning algorithms, clustering. So all the algorithms we discussed prior to this were supervised learning algorithms. So regression, classification, they're all supervised algorithms. And supervised learning algorithms, as you know, require label data. So the training data needs to have the output variable y, be it a continuous value like for regression or a discrete class label for classification. But unsupervised learning algorithms, on the other hand, don't require this y label data, and that can happen quite often, right? You just get sample data and you don't know what the category is or what the predicted output value is. In those scenarios, your algorithm should be such that it can learn from the patterns in the data and then try and categorize it. So in this case, these categories are actually clusters. And I think you must have heard of the term clusters. You know, you say, okay, there is this cluster of a particular type of objects in this area, or this is a cluster for technology companies, or this is a cluster for biotech companies. You know, different cities and different areas are sometimes called such. So similarly, you have clustering algorithms which look for similarity in the data and then accordingly try to segregate them into different clusters. So it's an unsupervised learning algorithm and it uses unlabeled training data. So it only has the X independent variables and then it predicts its own Y output clusters or classes. And for that, again, it uses a similarity measure like distance or density. So we've explained what distance-based similarity measures are quite well in the classification lecture. So please refer that to understand that better. And here you have other concepts like density. So you know how concentrated the data is around certain clusters. Let's just go back to the data science process slide on the algorithm selection again, just to refresh your memory. You know, you can always go back to that entire lecture and read it again to understand all the basics about the process. So if you remember, when we were trying to select the right algorithm for your problem, uh, we said, you know, that it depends on three parts: the prediction type, the problem type, and the sample size. Now here we are splitting the prediction types based on the labeled or unlabeled data. So we've discussed the supervised learning algorithms because all the labeled data that we've used up till now is an example of that. And we used regression and classification models, solving both linear and non-linear problems. But now we have unlabeled data and we need to predict certain clusters or categories or groupings to make sense of that data. And that's where we are using these unsupervised learning algorithms. Neural networks are also very useful here. In fact, generally for unsupervised learning, neural networks work very well, but with the limitation that you need a large number of data samples. And again, it's not necessarily the best algorithm to use for all the problems, right? So you have to be careful there. So if we look here for our clustering algorithms, your output is basically a group or a cluster, and these are all the different algorithms that can be used, and we'll be discussing them as part of this lecture series. So now, if you look at this sample data here, and you've got bunch of data points and they represent all your X independent variables and they're plotted on this simple two-dimensional axis. Now, how does the clustering algorithm work? What it does is it starts with this unlabeled sample data and then performs multiple iterations of a certain number of steps. What does it do? First, it splits the data into a target number of clusters and calculates their centroid. So if you look here, all these black points, we've now tried to split them into two clusters or groups. And what we decided was that, okay, these are the blue points, which are the cluster one, and The green points are the cluster 2, and then we'll calculate their centroid. The centroid is effectively the center for all these points. So if you take an simple example of mean or average of your data, that's generally the center of your data. Similarly, in terms of geometry, and if you have multi-dimensional data or even two-dimensional data, you'll need to calculate their centroid by using different distance metrics, like Euclidean distance, for example. So what we do is we find the centroid, so all the points, the center, what is their distance, and this is the best optimized center for this cluster 1. Similarly for cluster 2. Once you've done that, what happens is that you'll find that some of the points in these two clusters now need to be rearranged, right? Because see, they're still closer to each other, a little bit jumbled up. So you'll reassign some of these points to the different clusters, which will require recalculating of the centroid, right? Because see, the centroid is calculated using the distance of all these points. So if you've got new points, then the calculation will change. So your centroid will become different again. So it will have probably a different location. Same thing with cluster 2. So you now have two new centroids. And this process of reassigning the points to the two clusters, recalculating these centroids continues till we get an optimized centroid for each cluster. So that's effectively the set of steps which are performed in iteration. And hence, this is why clustering is a multi-objective optimization algorithm. Because what's happened is you've got multiple clusters and you have to optimize the centroid for each of them using your entire sample training data set. Now, these clusters are user-defined, and there are different ways to find the optimal values or the initial seed value too. So we'll discuss that as part of the algorithm. So effectively, once you've optimized these two clusters, your final result would look something like this. Your two clusters, blue and green, are here with their individual centroids. And now, if you have to calculate the cluster to which a new data set belongs, then you take the data set point and calculates its distance to the different points in the different clusters and look for the similarity or shortest distance. So we'll show you the different clustering algorithms and what kind of similarity measures they use. Now, some metrics which are used for clustering are given. So the first one is Silhouette coefficient. Now that defines how well defined and dense the clusters are. Now this is useful when the actual values are unknown for y variables, right? It's between -1 and 1, and the closer to 1, the better. So the metric lies between -1 and 1, and you want it to be closer to 1. So what's happened here is, if you go back to this slide here, you can see that these clusters are reasonably dense. I think that's because we've got a small sample data. But if you had a large number of points and they were really spread out, then that's not very good, because then you'd have very variable and slightly overlapping clusters. Whereas if they are very dense and concentrated, you can understand the different groups in your data and then take the decisions based on that. So that's the first metric, Silhouette coefficient. The next one is the adjusted rand index. Now that's proportional to the number of sample pairs with the same labels for the predicted and the actual y labels. Okay, so here you need to know the y output labels in the training data. So this is slightly counterintuitive, because if you remember, we mentioned in clustering, you don't need the output y labels, be they continuous or discrete. But in case you get it, um, then in that case you can use this metric and see the accuracy of your cluster. So how well are the clusters defined by once again calculating the proportions between the actual and the predicted values of y. It's between 0 and 1 because it's a proportion, and the closer to 1 it's better, the closer the fit. So just be careful, this requires the y labels in the training data, and when you have such training data you need to ignore those y labels when building the clustering model. So we'll show you that when we build the models using Python code. The other two metrics, homogeneity and completeness, measure how distinct the clusters are. So basically, uh, the more the members of one single class are in a given cluster, the better that cluster is, right? Effectively, if you have a distinct cluster with only members of one class or category, it's a well-defined cluster, and you can then have minimum errors because you have the correct categorization of data. But if you have different categories in one cluster, then you have errors, right? And then it'll be difficult to make decisions based on that because now your clusters are not distinct. And the whole objective around clustering is to create distinct groups or clusters from the data that you get. So both are between 0 and 1, and closer to 1 the better. In homogeneity, each cluster contains only members of a single class, and in completeness, all the members of a given class are assigned to the same cluster. So slightly different variations of the same concept. So these are the main metrics used. Some of them can be applied to some algorithms and some can't. So we'll show you that. And all the clustering algorithms use some kind of a distance or similarity metric. So when we discuss them, you'll understand that. Now let's look at the scikit-learn's guide for clustering. So you have all the details here. It shows you all the different clustering algorithms you can use, compare them in terms of their parameters, scalability use cases, and then all the details around their mathematics, examples, and how to plot them. So it's a very good guide. Please go through this to get more information. And in fact, what we've done is copied that chart here. I mean, it's a very good comparison matrix. So here, if you look at the different models, uh, you have things like parameters, scalability. Now, our view is that if a model is not scalable, generally it's not a good idea to use that. I mean, eventually you want to use a model which can handle growing data sizes. So you avoid using such models, and most likely the general purpose algorithms with the limited constraints in terms of density or the geometry are much better. And in fact, you'll find that k-means is one of the best models, and it's very popular in clustering, and it gives you the best results. So we'll discuss some of these models. Okay, so with that, we'll end this introduction to the clustering lecture series, and in the next lectures, we'll discuss all the different algorithms. Thank you.